April 8, 1942, dusk settled over the scarred ridges of southern Bataan like a dying ember. The jungles, once alive with the chatter of cicadas, now trembled under the thunder of artillery. The men of the U.S. Army forces in the Far East, Americans and Filipinos alike, clung to their foxholes with hollow eyes and skeletal hands. Their uniforms were torn, their boots rotted through, and their stomachs gnawed by weeks without rations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Colonel Edward King Jr., commanding general of the Luzon force, stood near the roadside at Lamao, staring north toward the silent guns. Behind him, the remnants of the 57th Infantry and the 41st Division lay scattered, men too weak to move, some too delirious to speak. For months they had held the line against Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa's 14th Imperial Army. But now, malaria, dysentery, and starvation had done what bullets could not. King's staff had gathered around a flickering lamp inside a battered tent. "We can't hold another day," whispered Major Wade Cothran, his voice barely above the crackle of the lantern. "The ammunition dumps are gone, Colonel. We've got men fighting with 2 clips apiece." King's reply came slowly. "I know." He took off his helmet and rubbed the grime from his eyes. "I'll take the responsibility. No more men will die for a lost cause." Outside, the news spread in whispers, "Surrender." Some soldiers cursed, others wept, many simply stared at the ground. For 4 brutal months they had fought without hope of reinforcement. The promise of General MacArthur's return, once shouted from the jungles like a prayer, had turned to an echo. Before dawn on April 9, 1942, a small white flag was tied to a bamboo pole. Colonel King and his aides drove toward the Japanese lines near Lamao. At kilometer post 167, they met a Japanese staff officer under a parched acacia tree. "We surrender unconditionally," King said quietly, in the presence of Captain Akil C. Tistel, his interpreter. The Japanese officer, emotionless, bowed stiffly. "The Emperor accepts," he said. "Your men will be treated according to the rules of war." The lie would soon reveal itself. By noon, the Americans and Filipinos began to emerge from the jungle, rifles slung upside down, helmets in hand. Over 76,000 men, roughly 12,000 Americans and 64,000 Filipinos, laid down their arms. It was the largest surrender in U.S. military history. Japanese soldiers watched, some with curiosity, others with contempt. Private Henry Stokes of the 31st Infantry later wrote in his diary, "Recovered after the war, they lined us up in rows. The heat was like an oven. We hadn't eaten in days. I remember one man collapsing beside me, he didn't get back up." Homa's headquarters at Balanga buzzed with reports of victory. Japanese correspondents were already writing dispatches for Tokyo, "The American fortress of Bataan has fallen." But within the ranks of the 14th Army, confusion reigned. No transport, no rations, and tens of thousands of prisoners to move north to a camp no one had adequately prepared. At sunset, as the last gunfire faded, an eerie silence settled over the peninsula. The once proud U.S. and Philippine banners had been torn down, replaced by the red sun of Japan. The beaches of Mariveles glowed faintly with the reflection of burning trucks. In the distance, Manila Bay shimmered, mocking the men who had fought to keep it free. Colonel King sat beside a shattered jeep, staring into the dark. He had made his choice, to surrender so his men might live. Yet he could not know that their ordeal had only just begun. The march to Camp O'Donnell awaited, 65 miles of heat, thirst, and death. And so, as night closed over Bataan, the last defenders of freedom on the peninsula laid down their arms, not in defeat of spirit, but in exhaustion of flesh. The road north beckoned, and the nightmare had begun. The morning of April 10, 1942, broke heavily and hot. A haze hung over the plains north of Mariveles as thousands of prisoners, Americans and Filipinos alike, were corralled into makeshift columns. The surrender had been formalized less than 24 hours earlier, but already confusion rippled through the Japanese ranks. Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa's 14th Imperial Army had won the campaign, yet his victory came with an unexpected burden: 76,000 starving, diseased, and wounded captives. In his headquarters at Balanga, Homer reviewed dispatches from field officers. "We were told there would be perhaps 25,000 prisoners," he muttered to his chief of staff, Colonel Masanobu Tsuji. "But the number," he set the paper down, shaking his head. "We are not prepared for this." Tsuji, ever ruthless, was unmoved. "It is not our concern, General. They are enemy soldiers. They must march to the railhead at San Fernando." He tapped the map spread across the table. 65 miles. The strong will reach the end. The weak, he let the sentence die. Homa hesitated, recalling the Imperial Army's code of discipline and the Emperor's directive to treat prisoners according to international law. But supply lines were shattered, trucks destroyed, and food reserves nearly gone. The 14th Army itself was starving. In theory, the orders were clear: move the prisoners north under guard, then transport them by rail to Camp O'Donnell near Capas. In reality, there were no trucks, no water stations, and no plan. At dawn, Japanese units began herding prisoners from Marivols, Bagak, and Lamau onto the dusty road. Each column stretched for miles, gaunt men limping barefoot, their uniforms stiff with sweat and blood. Filipino soldiers leaned on makeshift crutches, Americans stumbled under the weight of what few belongings they carried. Some clutched photos, others only their canteens. Japanese guards, drawn from the 65th Brigade and 16th Division, were young, ill-trained, and furious. Many had lost comrades during the long siege of Bataan. To them, these prisoners were not men deserving pity, but enemies who had wasted Japanese lives. "Hayaku! Hayaku!" they shouted, faster. Striking lagging men with rifle butts or bamboo sticks. Private Vicente Santiago of the Philippine Scouts later testified, "We thought surrender meant mercy. Instead, they pushed us with bayonets. The road was long, and there was no food. Some tried to find water in the ditches, but the guards beat them." From the air, reconnaissance planes of the Japanese 4th Air Group circled lazily over the columns, a grim procession crawling across the peninsula. Heat shimmered off the road as the temperature climbed past 100 degrees. The air reeked of sweat, rot, and despair. At every crossroads, new groups were merged into the march. Homa's staff issued written orders to keep the prisoners moving with haste to San Fernando, but many junior officers interpreted haste as brutality. By midday, the first executions occurred. A wounded man who collapsed near Balanga was shot where he lay. Another, delirious with fever, was decapitated by a passing guard. Homa's intelligence officers recorded none of this in their official diaries. The Japanese 14th Army War Diary, later captured by Allied forces, mentions only, "movement of prisoners commenced. Progress is satisfactory." As evening approached, Homa stared out across the fields of Pampanga, where smoke from burning supply depots curled into the sky. His staff toasted victory with sake and rice balls, luxuries unseen by their captives. But the general remained silent. "I fear," he said finally, "this victory will stain the honor of Japan." Miles away, the first group of prisoners halted near the town of Orani. No water had been given. Men collapsed into the roadside dust, their lips cracked, their skin blistered. The guards shouted, and bayonets flashed in the setting sun. In the darkness, the moans of the dying rose from the fields. The march had only begun, and already the road north was marked with blood. The march wound northward like a slow-moving scar across the face of Bataan. By April 11, 1942, thousands of men, Americans, Filipinos, and a few civilian laborers caught in the confusion, trudged along the dusty road between Balanga and San Fernando. The air shimmered with heat, the ground baked hard as iron. What had begun as a transfer operation was already becoming a death march. The Japanese guards shouted constantly, rifles at the ready. "Hayaku! Faster!" Every few hundred yards, the column passed the bodies of those who had fallen behind, slumped shapes in khaki and olive drab, left where they died. No one dared stop to help. A man who did was bayonet through the ribs before the column had gone 10 steps. Private Henry Stokes of the 31st Infantry wrote later, in his affidavit to U.S. Army investigators, "We were ordered to march in groups of 100. Those who fell were shot. The sun was so hot it burned the soles of our feet through the shoes." By midday, the column reached the outskirts of Pilar. Villagers stood silently behind the fences, weeping as the prisoners passed. Some tried to slip through bananas or cups of water, only to be struck by guards. In one village, a Japanese soldier smashed a clay pot of water over an old woman's head. The men in the column watched, helpless. From the sky, flies thickened in clouds over the corpses. The stench clung to everything: uniforms, canteens, even breath. The road was lined with wrecked American trucks, overturned jeeps, and rusting artillery pieces abandoned during the retreat. Dogs sniffed the carcasses of dead pack mules. At a checkpoint north of Balanga, Captain Akira Kobayashi of the Japanese 65th Brigade recorded in his field notebook, "Discipline among guards is poor. Prisoners weak, many ill. Progress is slow." The understatement concealed the truth, that for every mile, dozens collapsed. Filipino soldiers suffered the most. Many had been fighting barefoot for weeks, surviving on rice husks and water from jungle streams. Now, under the glare of a merciless sun, their feet split open and bled. An American medic, Lieutenant William Dias, tried to help where he could, binding wounds with strips torn from shirts. He later recalled, "I gave my last quinine tablet to a Filipino boy. He died before we reached the next town." The marchers reached the town of Abuque by nightfall. There, they were forced into an open field to sleep. The Japanese posted guards around the perimeter. No food was given. No one dared move for fear of being shot. Some prisoners crawled to nearby ditches to drink stagnant water. Others simply lay staring at the stars. One American officer whispered to another, "They mean to kill us all." The other replied, "No, they just don't care if we live." By April 12, the line of men stretched over 30 miles long. Those who lagged behind were clubbed or bayonet. Trucks carrying Japanese officers roared past, kicking up dust that choked the prisoners. Occasionally, a guard would fire his rifle into the air for sport, or into a crowd of staggering men. At one bend near the town of Arani, a group of prisoners saw a hand-painted sign nailed to a tree, "San Fernando, 30 kilometers. It felt like another world away. By the third day, the marchers had begun to lose their sense of time. Heat and thirst blurred everything into one long agony. Men walked in silence, their minds reduced to the next step, the next breath. A Filipino scout named Joaquin Mendoza later testified, "When we left Bataan, I had 120 men. When we reached San Fernando, only 40 remained." The march was no longer about orders or surrender, it had become a struggle against the very limits of human endurance. Ahead lay San Fernando, the next waypoint in their torment. And beyond that, the rail cars. The road to San Fernando was paved not with stones, but with bones. By April 13, 1942, the heat had risen like a wall. The sun hung mercilessly above the prisoners as they shuffled through the dusty plains north of Abuque. Sweat had long since stopped forming, their bodies had no moisture left to give. Each breath tasted of dust and iron. The line of captives stretched endlessly, a river of staggering men weaving through rice fields burned brown by the sun. The marchers no longer spoke. Their lips were swollen, tongues cracked, eyes sunken deep into skulls. The thirst was worse than hunger, a pain that clawed at the throat and hollowed the mind. When a prisoner stumbled near a puddle, he fell to his knees and tried to scoop up the muddy water with trembling hands. A Japanese guard shouted, and the man froze. Then came the dull thud of a rifle butt, the flash of a bayonet, and silence. Lieutenant William Dias, who would later escape Camp O'Donnell and testify before the U.S. Senate, recalled that moment vividly. Men went insane from thirst. They'd crawl to ditches filled with carcasses just to get a mouthful. The guards killed anyone who stopped. We started calling it the water test. You either resisted the thirst or you died. Filipino civilians watched from the roadside, faces hidden behind handkerchiefs. Some whispered prayers as the columns passed. Others risked their lives to toss food or coconuts toward the prisoners. A woman near the town of Lubao rolled a coconut across the road. A guard caught her, she was dragged away screaming, and the sound of gunfire followed moments later. The prisoners walked on, unable to turn their heads. For the Japanese guards, the march became an exercise in cruelty. Many were fresh conscripts, farmers and students from Kyushu or Hokkaido, taught that surrender was dishonor. Their commanding officers told them that the Americans had burned villages and killed civilians, lies meant to justify revenge. Some guards obeyed orders with cold precision, others took pleasure in inflicting pain. Private Ichiro Watanabe, later captured in 1945 and interrogated by Allied officers, confessed, "We had no orders to kill, but the men were angry. They had fought so long on Bataan. They thought the prisoners were animals. I saw a sergeant shoot a Filipino who begged for water." By the fifth day, the road north became a trail of corpses. Buzzards circled overhead, swooping low to feed on the dead. The smell, a mix of rot, sweat, and gunpowder, followed the column like a ghost. Those who still stood began hallucinating. Some spoke to people who weren't there, others thought they saw rain clouds on the horizon that never came. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At Balanga, a group of prisoners stumbled into a grove where a few Japanese officers rested in the shade. A water drum stood nearby. One of the prisoners, delirious with thirst, broke from the line and ran toward it. He didn't make it 3 steps before a guard shot him in the back. The sound echoed through the trees. The drum of water remained untouched. The survivors learned to move like shadows, eyes forward, never breaking formation. They whispered to one another, "Just reach San Fernando." But each mile seemed longer than the last. As night fell, they were herded into a roadside field, no food, no water, only the buzzing of insects and the cries of the dying. Some men tried to drink from their own canteens, empty for days, pretending to feel liquid just to ease the agony. A Filipino prisoner named Corporal Emilio Ramos, interviewed after the war, said, "I prayed for death, but it would not come. I could still walk, so they made me walk. That was the punishment, to live." When dawn rose again over the plains of Pampanga, the column lurched forward once more. Behind them lay the bodies of friends and strangers alike, half buried in dust. Ahead lay San Fernando, and the promise of something worse. The sun had no mercy, and neither did man. By the 6th day, the survivors stumbled into San Fernando, hollow-eyed, blistered, and skeletal. They had walked nearly 60 miles through heat and death. For many, the end of the road meant only a new form of torment. The Japanese guards herded the men into a fenced compound beside the railway station, a patch of bare earth ringed with barbed wire. There, the prisoners collapsed, too weak to stand. It was April 14, 1942. The stench of decay clung to everything, to uniforms soaked with sweat, to bandages stiff with blood, to the bodies piled at the edge of the yard. A few local Filipinos dared to approach, throwing bits of rice wrapped in banana leaves through the wire. Guards beat them back with rifle butts. "San Fernando," one American whispered, voice barely audible. "We made it." But the respite was a cruel illusion. By mid-morning, trucks rumbled toward the compound carrying Japanese officers. Orders were shouted. The prisoners were divided into groups of 100. Guards jabbed with bayonets, forcing them toward the railway siding, where rows of steel boxcars waited, relics of the Manila-Dagupan line, built for freight, not men. Each car was roughly 20 feet long, meant to carry 40 soldiers or 8 horses. Yet the Japanese packed 100 prisoners into every car, sealing the doors behind them. No air holes. No windows. Just darkness and heat. Private George W. Johnson of the 192nd Tank Battalion recalled, "The air was so thick you couldn't breathe. We were jammed chest to back, shoulder to shoulder. The steel sides burned like a furnace. Men began to scream, but there was nowhere to move. Inside, panic spread quickly. The temperature rose past 110 degrees. Men clawed at the wooden walls, gasping for oxygen. Some fainted standing up. Others collapsed and were trampled. A few tried to pry open the slats with mess kits, but the metal burned their hands. The smell of sweat and vomit filled the car. From outside, the guards laughed and smoked cigarettes as the train jerked forward. The wheels screeched against the rails, dragging the boxcars north toward Capiz, a 40-mile journey that would take 4 hours. Lieutenant Diaz later testified, "It was like being sealed in an oven. When someone died, we had to hold the body upright so we could breathe. When the doors opened, men fell out like sacks." At every station along the way, Angeles, Bamban, Tarlac, the train slowed. Japanese sentries walked the line, checking for movement inside the cars. When they opened the doors at Capiz, a wave of heat and stench rolled out. Many prisoners were dead, their faces purple, eyes open and unseeing. Others crawled out on hands and knees, gasping for air. Japanese reports listed the trip as uneventful. The truth was far different. Estimates from post-war U.S. medical surveys suggest that as many as 1,500 men perished during the train transport. The official Japanese 4th Air Group war diary recorded nothing beyond POW transfer successful. At Capiz Station, the survivors were ordered to march once more, 7 more miles west to their final destination, Camp O'Donnell. Men stumbled forward like ghosts, barefoot, delirious, their bodies scorched by heat and hunger. Corporal Vicente Santiago, one of the few Filipinos to survive both the march and the train, later told investigators, "We thought death would end at San Fernando. But the train was worse. You could not breathe. You could not move. When we stepped out, the world smelled of death." As the last prisoners were unloaded, the tracks glistened with blood and sweat. The sun hung low, turning the sky red over Pampanga. The guards herded the men down a dirt road lined with sugarcane. For those who had survived the march in the boxcars, Camp O'Donnell loomed ahead, a name already whispered among them with dread. The men did not yet know that it would become one of the most lethal prison camps in the Pacific. Behind them, the train steamed south again, carrying empty cars and the echo of the dying. The march was over. The nightmare was not. The prisoners arrived at Camp O'Donnell beneath a searing afternoon sun. They had marched, crawled, and been carried the last 7 miles from Capiz. Ahead of them loomed the remnants of an old Philippine Army training camp, barbed wire fencing, collapsing barracks, and rusted water drums. For the tens of thousands who stumbled through its gates in mid-April 1942, it was the end of the march, but the beginning of another horror. A sign scrawled in both Japanese and English read, "Prisoner of War Camp O'Donnell." Beneath it, the first Americans and Filipinos passed out from exhaustion. Some never rose again. The camp had been built for 6,000 men. Within days, more than 60,000 Filipino soldiers and 9,000 Americans were crammed inside. There were no latrines, no kitchens, no running water. Disease spread faster than the guards could drag out the bodies. The single artesian well broke within the first week, leaving men to drink from open ditches fouled with excrement. Lieutenant William Diaz, whose later testimony before the U.S. Senate would reveal the camp's conditions, wrote, "We called it the Valley of Death. There was no medicine, no food, no mercy. Every sunrise, they carried hundreds to the burial pits. Rations consisted of a handful of rice once a day. The prisoners called it starvation rice, more husk than grain. Medical officers begged the Japanese command for quinine, sulfa, or even soap. They received nothing. Dysentery swept through the camp, followed by malaria, pneumonia, and beriberi. Within 3 weeks, over 1,500 Americans were dead. Filipino casualties mounted even faster. Corporal Emilio Ramos remembered, "They gave us 1 ladle of rice. We ate grass and leaves. When men died, we buried them in shallow graves, 20 or 30 in a hole. After the rain, bones came back again." At dawn, burial details formed, squads of surviving prisoners dragging the dead on bamboo poles to the edge of the camp. The odor of decay was everywhere. Men wrapped handkerchiefs around their faces, but it made little difference. The Japanese guards refused to let them burn the bodies, claiming fuel was too precious. One captured document from the Japanese 14th Army War Diary notes coldly, "Sanitation poor. Many prisoners die of illness. Discipline required." No mention of food, medicine, or aid appears. American doctors, many without instruments or drugs, worked with improvised tools, scissors filed into scalpels, strips of tent canvas for bandages. One field surgeon performed amputations with a razor blade boiled in a tin cup. Each day, the medical staff made lists of the dead, but soon they stopped, the numbers were too great. Despite the suffering, moments of compassion persisted. Filipino civilians from nearby Capiz risked execution to sneak food through the wire. Some left papayas and coconuts in the grass at night. Prisoners whispered prayers in English and Tagalog, holding one another upright when fever struck. In May, the Japanese finally separated the prisoners, Americans to one sector, Filipinos to another. Both sides continued to die by the hundreds. By June, over 20,000 Filipinos and 1,500 Americans had perished in Camp O'Donnell. The Japanese called it natural attrition. The prisoners called it what it was, slow extermination. When questioned after the war, General Homa claimed he never knew the scale of death inside the camp. But Allied investigators later found reports sent to his headquarters detailing the daily mortality. He had signed them all. By July 1942, the surviving Americans were transferred to Cabanatuan, another prison camp to the east. They left behind rows of rough wooden crosses in the red earth, markers for the nameless thousands who never made it out. As the last column departed, a Filipino chaplain whispered a prayer over the graves, for the men who walked to their deaths, and for those who walk still. Camp O'Donnell remained behind, silent and rotting beneath the sun, a monument to the cruelty of war, and to endurance beyond reason. News of what had happened at Bataan did not reach the United States for months. The Japanese sealed the Philippines behind a curtain of propaganda, broadcasting triumphant messages about the liberation of Asia. Yet across the Pacific, faint signals began to emerge, whispered through intercepted radio traffic, smuggled letters, and the scattered words of escaped prisoners. Slowly, the world began to grasp the scale of the tragedy. In Washington, D.C., the surrender of Bataan on April 9, 1942, had already been a crushing blow. The U.S. Army had never lost such a large force overseas. 76,000 men, American and Filipino, had laid down their arms. But it was not until the summer of 1942 that the War Department received the first verified accounts of the Death March. The story came through Lieutenant Commander Melville Jacoby, a correspondent for Time and Life magazines, who interviewed survivors evacuated from Corregidor before its fall. His dispatch described men shot for falling, bayonet for thirst, and buried alive. At first, U.S. censors hesitated to release the reports, fearing they would deepen despair. But by late 1943, President Roosevelt authorized full publication. The headlines were brutal. 10,000 die in Death March, read the New York Times. Public outrage swept the country. War bond sales surged. Recruitment lines lengthened. Families whose sons had served in the Philippines filled church pews from San Francisco to Boston. One mother, quoted by the Chicago Tribune, said, "They took our boys and starved them. My son will have his vengeance, even if it takes years." In the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur, now in Australia, read the same reports with grim determination. He had promised, "I shall return," and the Bataan tragedy burned that vow into his command. The survivors of the march became living symbols of American endurance, their suffering fueling the campaigns that would follow: New Guinea, the Solomons, Leyte. Meanwhile, in Japan, military authorities dismissed the reports as American lies. Yet in private, some officers knew the truth. The Japanese 14th Army Medical Department logs, captured after the war, recorded mortality rates at Camp O'Donnell that exceeded 200 per day. Tokyo ignored the data. It was easier to call the prisoners' deaths inevitable wartime loss. Among the Allies, the memory of Bataan shaped policy. British and Australian commands in Southeast Asia issued new survival manuals warning troops of what captivity under Japan might mean. The U.S. Army Medical Corps began a project codenamed Pacific Phoenix, studying tropical diseases and malnutrition based on testimonies from escaped POWs. Every lesson learned came from the dead. Back in the Philippines, local civilians who had helped feed or hide prisoners paid a terrible price. Japanese occupation police, the Kimpitai, executed dozens near Capiz and San Fernando. Entire villages were punished for aiding escapees. But even under terror, the memory of the march united the people. Resistance groups such as Marking's guerrillas and the Hikbalahap swelled in numbers, drawing strength from the memory of Bataan's fallen. By 1944, Allied radio broadcasts began naming the camps, O'Donnell, Cabanatuan, Davao. Families clung to static-filled messages, hoping for names of survivors. The U.S. Office of War Information aired dramatized accounts titled Echoes of Bataan, read by actors but based on sworn affidavits from returning soldiers. The broadcasts were both memorable and warning. One escapee, Captain William Dias, after months in hiding, reached Australia in 1943. His story, published as the Dias Report, stunned the nation. He wrote, "We carried men who begged for water. The guards laughed and shot them. They died calling for their mothers." His testimony was entered into the U.S. Congressional Record as evidence of Japanese war crimes. The phrase "Remember Bataan" soon adorned posters, banners, and bombers. It became not just a slogan but a moral compass, a promise to the dead that their suffering would not be forgotten. As the war turned and American forces pushed back across the Pacific, Bataan's memory moved with them, a quiet, relentless echo beneath the thunder of the advancing armies. When American forces landed on Leyte in October 1944, General Douglas MacArthur kept his word, "I have returned." For the men who had survived the Bataan Death March, those words meant more than strategy, they meant salvation. After nearly 3 years of captivity, disease, and forced labor, hope had been a faint ember. Now, that ember flickered to life again. In early 1945, U.S. Army Rangers, Alamo Scouts, and Filipino guerrillas launched Operation Thunderbolt, the daring raid on Cabanatuan prison camp. Intelligence reports suggested over 500 American POWs remained alive there, many survivors of the Death March in Camp O'Donnell. On the night of January 30, 1945, under cover of darkness, the Rangers crawled across open rice paddies, avoiding Japanese patrols and machine gun nests. At precisely 7:40 p.m., they struck. Within minutes, the camp erupted in chaos. Prisoners too weak to stand were carried by their rescuers, others limped toward the jungle, tears cutting through the dirt on their faces. One ranger later said, "When we told them they were free, they thought we were ghosts." The raid was a total success, 513 prisoners rescued, only 2 fatalities among the Americans. For the first time, the world saw the faces of the men who had survived Bataan. Emaciated and sunburned, weighing barely half their pre-war size, they became living proof of Japanese brutality and American resolve. In Manila, U.S. forces found evidence of massacres as they liberated the city, Japanese units executing prisoners rather than allowing their rescue. At Camp O'Donnell, soldiers uncovered mass graves exactly where survivors had said they would be. The burial pits stretched for hundreds of feet, marked only by the rusted remnants of helmets and boots. When the war ended in August 1945, the reckoning began. The Allied powers established the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, IMTFE, often called the Tokyo War Crimes Trial. Among those indicted was General Masaharu Homma, commander of the Japanese 14th Army during the invasion of the Philippines. His defense argued that he had no direct knowledge of the atrocities, that his subordinates were responsible. But the evidence was overwhelming. Captured Japanese reports, affidavits from survivors, and testimonies from his own staff painted a clear picture. Homma knew, and he did nothing. During the trial in Manila, former prisoners described the march in precise, harrowing detail. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Allen told the court, "I saw bayonet men who could not stand. I saw trucks run over the fallen. I can never forget the sound." Filipino witnesses recounted the same horrors. Even Japanese medical officers, under oath, admitted the mortality rates were unprecedented. Homo listened silently as the verdict was read, guilty on all counts. On April 3, 1946, he faced a firing squad outside Manila. When asked for final words, he reportedly bowed and said, "I accept my fate. I pray for peace." For the survivors of Bataan, justice brought little comfort. Many returned home to families who barely recognized them, their bodies broken and haunted by what they had endured. Yet they carried a quiet pride, not in victory, but in survival. They had witnessed the worst and lived to tell it. In 1952, the United States and the Philippines erected a monument at Mount Samet, the Bataan Memorial Cross, rising nearly 300 feet above the battlefield. Each April 9th, survivors and their descendants gather there to remember. As the Philippine flag waves beside the stars and stripes, old soldiers stand in silence, saluting the ghosts of their comrades. Over the decades, historians have confirmed the scale of the Bataan tragedy through U.S. and Japanese archives: more than 76,000 prisoners, a 65-mile march, and 10,000 dead, most Filipinos, but many Americans too. Each statistic conceals a story, a name, a face, a final breath beneath the tropical sun. The Bataan Death March remains one of the darkest chapters of World War II, a reminder that valor and cruelty often walk the same road. Yet from that suffering rose something enduring, the spirit of men who would not be broken, and the promise of nations that vowed never to forget them. "Remember Bataan," they said. And to this day, the world still does.